Welcome to Faith and Freedom, an audio feature produced by the Wagner Faith and Freedom Center located on the campus of Spring Arbor University. The Wagner Faith and Freedom Center serves as the nation's academic voice for faith, family, and freedom. And now here's your host for Faith and Freedom, Professor William Wagner.
Hey everybody, welcome to Faith and Freedom. I'm your host, Will Wagner. Today we address one of the most profound moral, constitutional, and cultural issues that are confronting this state, the great state of Michigan, and indeed our nation. Recently introduced legislation in the Michigan legislature would legalize doctor-assisted killing under what proponents call the Death with Dignity Act. I'm just going to call it the Death Act because that's really what it is, and we're going to get into that today. Now, my friends, let me say this at the outset. This debate is not just about healthcare policy. It's not just about pain management, and it's certainly not just about government-sanctioned personal autonomy. At stake is something far deeper. At stake is whether this great nation will continue recognizing inherent sanctity and dignity of every human life, or whether we will instead embrace a worldview where human value becomes conditional, where it becomes subjective, and ultimately determined by some kind of government-authorized, autonomous human will. Some lives are going to have value, and some lives will not. Some lives are worthy of protection, some lives are not. And so this is not simply a legal issue, folks. It is a constitutional issue, though we'll talk about that. It's a worldview issue. We're going to talk about that. It's a moral issue. And ultimately, it is an issue for all of civilization. Because once a society empowers doctors to heal by killing, it crosses a profound moral line. And history teaches us that once that line is crossed, the consequences rarely stay where they say it's going to stay, and it always expands to the most vulnerable and even to children. Our constitutional republic did not emerge from that kind of moral relativism, where some human life was worthy and some human life was not. The Declaration of Independence declares that human beings are endowed by their Creator, that's a capital C, folks, with certain unalienable rights, including life. Listed right in front is life, is one of our inalienable rights. Notice carefully, our rights do not come from government. They don't come from the courts. They don't come from legislatures. And they don't come from what the prevailing, cultural view might be on one of these MTV programs or something. They come from God. And foremost among those rights is the right to life. The American founders, the framers of our great Constitution, understood something that the modern culture increasingly forgets. Freedom cannot survive apart from moral truth. Ordered liberty depends upon the recognition of inherent human dignity. And once society abandons the sanctity of human life, liberty itself becomes very fragile. Because when government assumes authority to determine which lives retain sufficient dignity to deserve protection, eventually every other liberty rests upon shifting political power rather than some kind of what we call an enduring moral permanent principle. Liberty cannot survive apart from truth, folks. And for once we need to understand that. Because if we abandon truth, the power of the government is going to inevitably fill that void. At its core, this debate involves two fundamentally competing worldviews. One worldview recognizes that every human being is created in the image of God and therefore possesses inherent and invaluable dignity from conception until natural death. Under this view, life is sacred. Dignity is intrinsic, it's inherent. Rights are inalienable, and government exists to protect life, not to redefine its value. Let me say that again. Government exists to protect life. It's not there so that those in power can redefine its value and decide that certain lives are more valuable than others. The competing worldview, on the other hand, treats human value as very conditional. Under that framework, what I want, that's supreme. My autonomy, that is supreme. Suffering negates dignity. Utility determines worth. And life retains value only so long as the individual perceives it worthwhile. And more importantly, life retains value only so long as the government regime allows that individual to perceive it worthwhile. Because very quickly, it's the government regime that decides whether or not the individual human life is worthwhile. And once society accepts the premise that some lives no longer possess sufficient value to warrant protection, no principal boundary remains against expanding death to other categories of people under other circumstances for other reasons. History repeatedly, over and over and over again, confirms this truth. For example, the euthanasia movement in the United States did not begin with compassion. It began with a government regime classifying some human people as unworthy of protection. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, eugenics movements increasingly divided humanity into people that were productive versus people that were burdensome and weren't as worthy. People that were fit or unfit for life. People that were worthy or unworthy of remaining alive. Germany first embraced so-called voluntary euthanasia. But once society abandoned objective moral boundaries grounded in the sanctity of life, those categories expanded, and all of a sudden now we're going to euthanize the disabled, the mentally ill, the elderly, the socially undesirable. Tragic time in history. And history's lesson is unmistakable. Once the state authorizes intentional killing under limited exceptions, those exceptions inevitably expand. Always, every time. And so what's happening here in Michigan? Michigan is now standing at precisely such a crossroads. We're right at the crossroads of this issue. Recently introduced in the House of Representatives of the state legislature in Michigan, our House bills 5825 through 5828, and those bills are all tied together. And that proposed legislation would fundamentally transform Michigan law by authorizing doctor-assisted killing, restructuring the criminal law to accommodate it, insulating participating doctors from any kind of professional discipline for assisting in the killing of human life, and integrating assisted death into the state's insurance framework. So, folks, what's most revealing here is not merely what this proposed legislation permits. It's what they reveal about the worldview that underlies them. House Bill 5825, for example, the proposed, I'm just going to call it the Death Act, the proposed Death Act, would authorize physicians to prescribe lethal medication that is specifically intended. Okay, now understand this. This is what's the intent of the doctor here. A doctor is prescribing lethal medication with the intent to kill a human being. It's specifically what it says in the legislation. Think carefully about what this means. For centuries, medicine existed to heal and to comfort and to preserve life. And now, using all kind of flowery words, they say we're going to allow the doctor to have the intent to kill a human life, and they use flowery language to end a patient's life in humane and dignified manner. Well, how humane and dignified is it when you're killing a human being? especially when all throughout history, the medical profession was called to heal and to comfort and to preserve life. The Hippocratic Oath declared, "I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody, even if they ask for it." But once the doctor transitions from healer to life-ending technician, the moral integrity of the medical profession itself fundamentally changes. And folks, I'm here to tell you that it changes in very deteriorating ways. Trust in the medical profession erodes. Patients begin wondering, am I being treated or am I being managed toward death? And if you wonder if I know what I'm talking about, just go talk to some of the patients in Canada right now, where, no, your insurance isn't going to cover this thing that can make you well, but we do have insurance will cover if you kill yourself. You can't make this stuff up. Perhaps the most astonishing feature of Michigan's legislation is this. The proposed legislation expressly declares that physician-assisted suicide does not constitute suicide, does not constitute assisted suicide, does not constitute mercy killing, does not constitute homicide. And what kind of alternative reality are we living in when the law itself defines assisted suicide as not being suicide or assisted suicide? The companion insurance bill similarly states that suicide does not include an individual ending the individual's life. Where is this coming from? I mean, what kind of alternate reality are we living in when suicide is not suicide, when assisted suicide is not suicide under the law, when assisted suicide under the law is defined as not including an individual ending an individual's life? Now think about that. The state is no longer merely regulating conduct. The state is now attempting to redefine reality itself into some kind of alternative reality. What previous generations recognized as a tragic incidence of self-destruction is now recast completely as something that's supposedly therapeutic, something that's dignified, and something that's legally protected. So once truth becomes detached from objective moral standards, the law itself becomes an instrument of moral relativism. And so the entire legal system begins to change. The proposed legislation here also demonstrates how rapidly doctor-assisted killing expands beyond the isolated medical decisions into every major societal institution. One of the proposed pieces of legislation restructures Michigan's criminal law completely. Historically, killing a human being and assisting in the killing of a human being was a felony. Now, the state shifts from prohibiting assisted suicide, assisted killing, to regulating how it may legally occur. Folks, that's an enormous moral transformation. The proposed legislation integrates assisted suicide directly into Michigan's insurance systems. Historically, insurance law distinguished suicide precisely because society recognized the intrinsic and inherent value of human life and the tragedy of its self-destruction. The new legislation dismantles all those distinctions. And the proposed legislation, HB 5826, may be the most revealing piece of all these bills, of all of them. It protects physicians. It protects doctors participating in assisted suicide from professional discipline or investigation even. And so now assume this hypothetical. A doctor prescribes poison for a person to kill themselves, and the person's caregiver takes the patient home with the poison, and now the patient says, I really want to live. But the caregiver is tired of having to take care of this person. Puts the poison in their oatmeal. the doctor is completely immune from participating in this killing. And there's going to be no way that the caregiver is ever going to get caught. And nothing in the law protects the most vulnerable person in this hypothetical. That is a real life hypothetical. The Supreme Court has also, never recognized physician-assisted suicide. And many folks say, well, the Supreme Court says it is. And no, it hasn't. And I want to touch base on that for a few minutes here. Contrary to much of the public rhetoric out there, the United States Supreme Court has never recognized a constitutional right to physician-assisted suicide, even when people have brought cases asking for that very right to be added to the Constitution. The court has rejected that. In Cruzen versus the director of the Missouri Department of Health, the court recognized a patient's right to refuse unwanted medical treatment, and that's proper, But make sure you understand that's not assisted suicide. Here, the court is distinguishing between a patient allowing natural death. So the person comes in, the person's sick, the person's dying, and the person then dies from the pathology, from he naturally dies from the underlying pathology. Doesn't die because somebody has intentionally caused their death and imposed poison into their body. And then after the Cruzen case came the landmark case that almost every law student probably has read, the Washington versus Glucksberg. And there the Supreme Court unanimously held that no constitutional right to physician-assisted suicide exists in the Constitution. And guess what? You don't need to be a lawyer arguing before the Supreme Court to know that. Pick up your United States Constitution and read it. And guess what? Once you go through the First Amendment and the free exercise of religious conscience and the freedom of speech, and you get to the Fifth Amendment, right to due process, and the Second Amendment, right to bear arms, nowhere in here do you find a constitutional right to assisted suicide. And so the court made that holding. We looked at the Supreme Court. We looked at the Constitution. The Supreme Court says there's not a right to physician-assisted suicide. Lawyers, you're wrong for trying to ask us to put it in there. In fact, in that case, the court recognized that there were some very compelling government interests, but the government interest was on the other side. There's a compelling government interest to preserve life. There's a compelling government interest, the Supreme Court said, to protect vulnerable persons. There's a compelling government interest to prevent coercion and creating this duty to die. And the court said there's a compelling government interest to preserve the integrity of the medical profession. And then likewise in Vacco versus Quill, another Supreme Court case, the court again distinguished between a patient's right to refuse treatment, a right to say, doctor, you don't have the right to invade my body and assault my body, and I have a right to die naturally from the underlying pathology. And the court distinguished that from the intentional administration of poison to cause death, the intentional causing of death. And so when you hear folks trying to say, well, that, they're all the same thing. No, it's all about the intent here. When a person dies from and doesn't want extraordinary measures, forced into their body, that's not the same. Refusing those extraordinary medical procedures is not the same as demanding a right to have a doctor administer poison with the intent to kill. And so allowing the disease to take its course is not morally or constitutionally equivalent to intentionally prescribing lethal drugs with the intent to kill a human life. And more recently, the Dobbs versus Jackson case, which overturned Roe versus Wade, reaffirmed the principle that fundamental constitutional rights, they've got to be listed in the Constitution, or to be recognized by the Constitution, they've got to be deeply rooted in the American history and tradition. Assisted suicide plainly is not in there. And so I want to talk for a few minutes about the duty to die and how that is a real danger here. One of the gravest dangers is the cultural pressure that happens when assisted suicide becomes normalized. The elderly fear becoming burdens. They don't want to become a burden. They fear that they're becoming a burden. The disabled begin questioning their worth. And guess what? That only happens, there's some really good peer-reviewed research out there, that only happens in places where the government has made a law authorizing physician-assisted suicide, where laws requiring the doctors to participate in assisted suicide are not there, where there's no assisted suicide law. The elderly are not fearing becoming burdens. They're not, the disabled aren't beginning questioning their worth. It's only when you start imposing by law this right to assisted suicide that people begin to feel, I've got a duty to have this and exercise this because I'm becoming a burden or I'm not worthy. Likewise, where those laws are in place, families confront systems where death becomes cheaper than care. And so I can show you countries where, well, it's going to cost you this much if we make you well, but it's going to be a lot cheaper here, and insurance is going to cover it, cover assisted suicide, will not cover the... And so, wow, a choice between living and now have this false presupposition that you become a burden. It's almost like it becomes a utilitarian decision. It's better for all of society. It's going to be cheaper if you kill yourself. So we're really kind of putting you down that road. And too many, far too many. I think in Canada, 4% of all deaths occur that way, where a doctor intentionally provides poison to kill a person. So it's happening internationally. It's coming here. Once economic incentives enter the equation, vulnerable populations suffer first. The most vulnerable suffer, always, every single time. So I do want to stop for a moment and make sure we understand all of this through a Christian worldview, because I want to be absolutely clear. Christians and people of conscience must never minimize suffering. Pain is real. Terminal illness is heartbreaking. I've been through it. Families endure unimaginable burdens. But authentic compassion does not eliminate the sufferer. It cares for the sufferer. A human being is worthy of protection. Their life is worthy of protecting. A humane society responds with love, with hospice, with palliative care, with companionship, with support, and human dignity, not lethal poison. And so in closing here, ultimately, folks, this debate asks, what kind of civilization will we become? Will we remain a people who believe that every human life possesses inherent and inviolable dignity? Or will we become a society where autonomy supersedes morality, where utility supersedes dignity, and where death becomes a so-called therapeutic solution? Who we are morally as a people is shaped by far more than the statutes that the legislature is passing or trying to pass up in Lansing right now. Who we are morally as a people is shaped far more than any court opinion that might get handed down. Those who came before us built a constitutional democratic republic upon transcendent truths, the sanctity of life, the dignity of the human person, and the reality that rights come from God and not from a government regime. It's now our watch, and history will judge whether we preserve those truths or whether we surrender them. For when a nation ceases to honor the sanctity of life it ultimately loses the moral capacity to sustain liberty itself. Indeed, as the good book says, righteousness exalts a nation. Until next time, this is Professor William Wagner for Faith and for Freedom and for such a time as this.